Before I hand it over to the Senate President, I wanted to run through our agenda for the event really quickly. We're going to go through some welcome and introductions. We're going to talk a little bit about the current moment in COVID-19. We're going to talk about what social emotional learning is, how to support our students' well-being, and strategies for educators and families. We're going to wrap up with the presentation, and then we're going to turn it over to a panel discussion with experts from across the community. I wanted to introduce the Senate President, Karen Spilka, who represents the MetroWest community. She is a former school committee member and a social worker, and really recognizes the role of mental health in education, and has organized this forum and invited us here today to share with you the benefits of social and emotional learning and the opportunities and current challenges that your community faces for implementing SEL in schools. So I'm going to hand it over to Senate President Karen Spilka.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks to all for joining us today. I'm Massachusetts Senate President Karen Spilka, and today we have a really special and terrific program for you to talk about our students, from our youngest to our oldest, supporting our students through COVID-19 and beyond. 4 years ago, I began hosting events like today's as annual MetroWest Kids Social and Emotional Learning Forums. Each and every year, I really look forward to these events because they are filled with so much information that we can all use. For those of you who don't know, you'll hear a lot more about the technical definition of social and emotional learning from the experts that are here today. But in short, it's the kind of learning whereby a person gains a greater ability to make their own decisions as they set goals and take charge of their emotions and relationships with others. It's really about helping young people find their way in the world. So I started these forums because I felt that young people's social emotional learning should be a strong part of a wider response to an unmet need in our community. That is the need for more understanding of the role mental and behavioral health plays in all of our lives, and the need for quality care and quality support. As a former social worker, the need for these supports across Massachusetts is simply staggering. It's also personal to me. Growing up, I knew how much the lack of support for mental illness affected not only my father, who suffered from it, but my entire family, all 4 kids and my mother. As a kid, I learned to, because I had to, compartmentalize school from home life, which was tough at times. Trauma at an early age literally changes how your brain works. Consequences are long-lasting. I really do not think I'd be in this position that I am if it were not for the sense of stability that I got from school and the opportunity that a few teachers and a caring guidance counselor gave me to develop socially and emotionally. While this kind of situation may not apply to everyone, the need for mental and behavioral health affects all of us, not only across the Commonwealth, but our country. Our mental health and our young people's mental health was a pressing need before the pandemic. As we all know, for many young people, this past year has been the hardest of their lives. Separation from peers, ordinary routines and support networks take a real toll on individuals' lives and their well-being. Their anxiety is very real, and some of the strongest tools to reduce stress right at the source are the very same tools that students in an ordinary year would be working on in the classroom right now. Studying at home affects children in a number of ways, but one of the biggest changes that I am concerned about is the students' social emotional learning. Responsible decision-making, empathy in a healthy relationship, recognition of one's own emotions, and understanding one's own idea of success in life are all things that are harder for kids to naturally work on right now, or for educators, it's almost impossible for them to transmit it through the computer screen. Yes, there are things that we as parents, as educators, as active community members can absolutely do. That's why I am truly excited for today's event. We have some wonderful education experts here. And before we get started, I would like to give my very sincere thanks to the panelists for their sharing of time and expertise with us today. Here with us today is Tiffany Lilly, the Director of Community Resource Development for Framingham Public Schools. Tiffany is someone who's given me and community organizations a lot of guidance over the years as to what's happening on the ground in our schools, and is a very powerful advocate for the needs of our Commonwealth's students. We also have with us today Katie Brown, who is the transition coordinator at Natick High School. Katie's work prepares educators and school staff to better understand the topics discussed today, and also works with students and families individually to help plan for their long-term success. Completing the panel is John Crocker, who is the Director of School Mental Health and Behavioral Services at Methuen Public Schools. John is recognized across the state as an organizer for comprehensive mental health systems in schools. He is the founder and the director of a consortium of school districts across Massachusetts committed to supporting student mental health. Thank you for being here today. I do want to also acknowledge and thank our interpreters here. Great work. You also are behind the scenes, but greatly appreciated. And thank you truly to all the folks at the Rennie Center for education, research, and policy, and who have put so much work into running this. The moderator on today's panel, Annalise Eaton, is the Rennie Center's research director. She's worked with school districts across the country to help them both understand the latest research and implement the findings right in the classrooms. But last and definitely not least, also here from the Rennie Center is Sophie Zamarripa, who's worked with classrooms in a hands-on way to better use social and emotional learning. So thanks to all of you. I really, really appreciate it. I hope all of you get a lot out of the next hour and a half. Thank you, and I will turn it over because Sophie will start us with an explanation of SEL. With that, I turn it over to Sophie for your presentation. Thanks so much. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Madam President. I'm really looking forward to all of the work that we hope to do with all of you, and I'm going to get us started. So, just a quick introduction. You heard a little bit about the Rennie Center. We are an independent nonprofit education research and policy organization in downtown Boston, really in our homes across the country right now, but that's just how the world has been lately. The mission of the Rennie Center is to improve public education through well-informed decision-making based on deep knowledge and evidence of effective policymaking and practice. As the Senate President has said, I am Sophie Zamarripa. I'm an associate at the Rennie Center. My experience working with social emotional learning has been working with school districts across the country as a consultant, evaluating programs and practices within districts that serve students' social, emotional, and behavioral needs. In addition, over the summer, I supported our Rennie Center team in creating 7 back-to-school blueprints, which were action guides that provided key strategies for educators and school leaders for returning to school, including some of the SEL strategies you'll hear more about today. My colleague Annalise Eaton will be facilitating our panel of experts later, so you get to meet her more in a little bit. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit about the current moment, COVID-19, and how that has impacted our students and families in a few different ways. So COVID-19 has really brought about collective and individual trauma among students and families, has disrupted our daily routines, and has led to academic learning loss. To get us started, I'm going to just provide a little bit of a definition of what trauma means and what it looks like. So we know that because of the pandemic, the entire world has felt an effect of trauma for students, families, educators, communities, and more. In particular, COVID-19 has added to the deep layers of trauma and oppression felt among marginalized communities, making it essential for schools to apply an equity lens alongside trauma-sensitive and healing-centered practices. For instance, children of color experience racial trauma from acts of racism and discrimination that occur in their schools and communities and have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. As we've unfortunately seen recently, Asians and Asian Americans have faced increased discrimination and prejudice in schools and in the community. And in Massachusetts, across the nation as well, Black and Latinx residents have experienced significantly higher rates of COVID-19 infection than white residents. So when we're implementing trauma-sensitive practices, educators must recognize the differentiated impact of trauma on communities, families, and students of color. So what does trauma look like? How does trauma show itself in our students in particular? Trauma can show itself in a few different ways. The first is academic difficulty. Children who have experienced trauma may experience difficulty with memory, organizational skills, and verbal skills, as well as behavioral changes. So children who have experienced trauma may exhibit internalizing symptoms such as withdrawal, as well as externalizing symptoms such as aggression. And then finally, children who have experienced trauma may have difficulty trusting adults and peers, and they often lack appropriate social skills, making it difficult for them to form positive relationships, which are really vital for their success in school. In addition to trauma, we've experienced disrupted routines. Because COVID-19 has caused such a widespread disruption to our daily lives, whether we're at work, at home, at school, families have been forced to adjust to long-term changes in their daily schedules. These changes can mean a loss of skills gained during schooling or out of school time, and they can lead to increased anxiety, depression, and behavioral needs, not only among students, but as well their families as well. And then finally, one of the key things that we want to provide to you is information about the academic learning loss that that COVID-19 has created. The COVID slide is what we are trying to call it, which is really a continuation of the term for the summer slide, which refers to when students are out of school for an extended period of time, either over the summer or through other ways, and they lose some of the learning that they gained over the previous year. However, we want to make sure that this is understood in terms of the discrepancies and disparities that are felt among different student groups. While white students entered the school year with 1 to 3 months of learning loss in math, Students of color lost 3 to 5 months, and those trends are expected to continue through the end of this school year, when students will, on average, be expected to lose almost 5 to 9 months in math. We see that this quote from a McKinsey and Company study said that while all students are suffering, those who came into the pandemic with the fewest academic opportunities are on track to exit with the greatest learning loss. So we really understand that a growing number of educational leaders and commentators across the country are arguing that schools should really be focusing on addressing the learning loss that students are likely suffering since they've been closed last spring due to the pandemic. Some of the policies that could be put in place include extended summer school, year-round learning, grade retention, intensive online and in-person tutoring, and boot camps that allow students to concentrate on making up lost ground and mastering basic skills. However, the reason that we're here today is that we understand the importance that social emotional learning plays in allowing students to feel comfortable and ready to learn. A wide body of research shows that the single best thing schools can do to help young people persevere through the COVID-19 pandemic is to build and strengthen relationships with and among them. Social emotional learning is so important at this time because if students aren't feeling safe and supported, they can't accomplish their academic goals. We are talking about SEL today and trauma-informed practice because we need to address this first among our students before we can address the learning loss. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what social emotional learning actually is and how social emotional learning can positively impact students who have experienced trauma, like the trauma faced during COVID-19. Social emotional learning is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to do a number of things, to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. This definition comes from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, otherwise known as CASEL, and the Senate President has worked with CASEL to provide information about social emotional learning to her constituents. We at the Rennie Center like to differentiate and build off a definition created by folks and researchers at CASEL to talk about transformative SEL. Transformative SEL is a better way to articulate the potential that social emotional learning has to mitigate educational, social, and economic inequities stemming from interrelated legacies of cultural, racialized oppression in the United States and globally. For social emotional learning to adequately serve those from underserved communities and promote development outcomes for children, youth, and adults, it really needs to cultivate in them the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action to address root causes of inequity. Transformative SEL is a process where students and teachers build strong and respectful relationships founded on appreciation of similarities and differences, and learn to critically examine root causes of inequity, develop collaborative solutions to community and social problems. Transformative SEL is really rooted in the notion of justice-oriented citizenship and brings to the table issues of culture, identity, agency, belonging, and engagement, explored as relevant expressions of the 5 core SEL competencies. So it really builds on this previous definition that I showed you before by pulling together this idea of the collective as a way to think about how we can solve the inequities in our society. And it takes into account the socio-political context for children and adults. So why does transformative social emotional learning matter right now? Why are we talking about this to you? So transformative SEL really gets at the root of the causes of the inequities that we talked about earlier, thinking through trauma, thinking through the disrupted routines, thinking through the academic learning loss and how we can set our students and teachers and families up for success. So transformative SEL can support youth who have experienced trauma in multiple ways. We know that children returned to school this year grappling with the emotional impact of the global pandemic and nationwide confrontation with persistent racism. In addition to a disrupted daily routine and a long period of isolation from classmates, many students have experienced widespread suffering in their community that includes joblessness, housing instability, illness, and economic insecurity. And in this time, as in others, the collective harm has disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color. In Transformative SEL, we're really trying to move away from action items or theories that still place the quote unquote blame on the student or on the individual. And we need to be careful to understand what the aim of the strategies are on the slide that defined social emotional learning are. Therefore, in order to address social emotional learning in a transformative way, we need to understand a few things. We need to promote student self-awareness, which includes understanding one's emotions, personal and social identities, goals, and values. We need to help students with self-management, which requires skills and attitudes that facilitate the ability to regulate emotions and behaviors. We need to increase social awareness, which involves having the critical historical grounding to take in perspectives of those with the same and different backgrounds. We need to cultivate relationship skills that includes interpersonal sensibilities and facility needed to establish and maintain healthy and rewarding relationships. And finally, we need to instill a responsible decision-making power that requires the cultivation of knowledge, skills, and attitudes to allow students to make caring, constructive choices about personal and group behavior and social interactions. This is the way that Transformative SEL can help support our students as they respond to the ongoing trauma and situation of the pandemic, to allow them to have voice, agency, and ability to understand what's going on in the world around them and how they can impact that. So now I'm going to provide some strategies that we've written about before at the Rennie Center through extensive research on how to support students' well-being and how we can do these through strategies for schools, communities, and families. So an overview of the strategies that I'll provide for you today are to build a sense of belonging, to support student voice and agency, to develop meaningful family partnerships, and some strategies to allow you to do social emotional learning at home. These thematic strategies, again, have been featured in many of our back to school blueprints and remain salient in multiple focus areas. Keep in mind that these strategies are specified for educators and school leaders in the beginning, and then through the final section are for families. Schools and communities should continuously learn from success and failures and stay in collaboration with each other to identify more strategies that can be successful to support social emotional learning. So let's get started. In order to build a sense of belonging and think about that through the lens of remote learning, we need to require a dedication to building strong relationships between educators, students, and maintaining meaningful peer relationships. While students have been learning remotely, it can be a lot harder for them to engage in relationship building since they lack the shared spaces where they can practice certain social, emotional, and conflict resolution skills. Relationships are vital to fostering a sense of belonging, and a school community includes many different types of relationships. So student to teacher, peer to peer, teacher to family, school leader to teacher, and so on. Educators can use the following strategies to strengthen these various connections and create opportunities for meaningful interaction. Routines and rituals. Transferring normal classroom routines and rituals can be a useful strategy to offer consistency and build trust and confidence within a remote learning environment. This can include anything from morning circles, weekly themes, and periodic check-ins. Mentorship programs can be established to provide opportunities for students to interact with both peers and adults to strengthen their academic skills and form positive relationships. Through a mentorship program, adults can serve as a trusted resource for students. In addition, peer mentoring is a great way to strengthen peer-to-peer relationships across the school. Finally, affirm student identity. Providing the space for students to explore and affirm their identities through literature, classroom projects, and storytelling can instill community and a healthy sense of self among all students. Educators can help students set students on a positive course by infusing social emotional practices into daily instruction to ensure students feel safe, secure, and ready to learn. The next strategy is to support student voice and agency. We know that in school systems, adults typically act as the powerful gatekeepers to learning. But what happens when we share that power? When students' idea and knowledge, opinions, and experiences are incorporated into education and are actively sought out and substantiated by educators, administrators, and other adults, educators can catalyze meaningful student involvement. The school community is strengthened when students are able to play an active role in shaping their learning environment, and some of the strategies to do so are to provide opportunities for students to impact their community. So empowering students to critique and dismantle any inequities they face in their communities, in particular for older students, things like capstone projects and other remote friendly activities can cultivate activism, social justice mindsets, and a positive connection with diverse communities. Provide voice and choice in the classroom. Co-constructing rules and norms for remote learning, offering student-led video conferences, and incorporating student input into remote curriculum can really foster a sense of safety and collaborative control among students. And finally, provide voice and choice at the school level. Administrators and educators can work with students to identify and recommend school climate improvement strategies, collaborate on decision-making processes, and establish inclusive bodies for students to incorporate themselves into things like student government. For all of you parents out there, you can reflect on some of the following key strategies to know if your child is having experiences at school that support their voice and agency. So think about this. Does your child's school invite family and student feedback on the remote learning process? This may include providing formal leadership roles on school-based committees or regularly hosting family forums to gather input on student progress. Does your child's teacher offer multiple types of instruction, including both live and self-directed instruction, and use multiple strategies to keep students engaged, such as opportunities for discussion, interactive games or activities, visual media, and content related to students' individual interests? Our next strategy is to develop meaningful family partnerships. As families suddenly face the need to educate their children at home amid a global health crisis, they were likely to encounter challenges with this transition. This is especially true considering that around 3/4 of Massachusetts students under the age of 12 live in households where all available parents work. For these families, school closures meant balancing students' learning needs with job demands, either remote or in person. In a recent poll, a majority, 57% of parents reported that remote learning has had negative emotional impacts for their children. Now that family members are at the front lines of student support, educators should help them identify strategies for supporting their children's non-academic needs as well as academic. One of those ways is to provide clear two-way communication with families. Educators and school leaders can map out who is responsible for sharing out information through what channels and in what necessary languages. Staff should connect with families to identify their preferred communication type, and communication should always be inclusive and utilize an asset-based lens. Create a range of opportunities for family involvement and connection. Find opportunities to bring families together virtually or safely in person. This can include virtual coffee chats, volunteer opportunities, and community events when it's safe. Ensure that bilingual staff or interpreters are present to allow full participation by non-English speaking families. And finally, which we'll talk about in just a second, give families the tools to incorporate SEL at home. Provide tips and techniques to families on how to incorporate SEL at home, including information on self-care, routines, expression and naming of emotions, and active listening. If you're looking for ways to see if your school has focused on developing meaningful family partnerships, try asking yourself these questions. Does my child's school provide information through multiple channels and invite me to communicate with them in multiple ways? Does my child's school set up opportunities for me to connect with other families, such as through learning management systems, social media, or parent groups, so we can get to know each other and share successful strategies for supporting learning at home? Does my child's school share how to access school-based supports, such as school counselors, and community-based supports, such as outside service providers, for any social, emotional, or mental health challenges my child faces? And finally, does my child's school share tips about how to structure learning time and set expectations? We have put together at the Rennie Center a family guide for remote learning, available currently in both English and Spanish on our website, and I will share that information for you a little bit later. So now we're going to talk a little bit about SEL at home, but rather than hearing from me, I'm going to turn it over to this video for a couple minutes and you'll be able to hear that for yourself. But I actually think that I need to very quickly screen share with my sound. So give me 1 second. All right, and feel free to let me know if you cannot hear the sound.
As parents, we know that there is more to raising a child than teaching reading, writing, history, and math. Raising a child means that schools and parents must work together to create safe and supportive environments while helping children to understand themselves, understand others, and make responsible decisions.
It's important for children to see that they have role models that aren't always the ones that they expect to have.
You know that saying that parents are the first teachers, that's very true, because I think that as a school, there's only so much that we can do.
I think parent involvement in school is huge because I think it's really important when kids feel the partnership that their families have with a school. And so we work to have structures and systems in place that will help kids be able to do those things.
Social and emotional learning, or SEL, is how children and adults understand and manage their emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions.
When adults are modeling SEL for students, whether it's parents or teachers or staff members, they're really building relationships with one another, which ultimately impacts how they work with one another as adults.
I think it's really, really important for them to be self-aware. I think being able to identify their emotions and deal with them, it's sometimes really important to be able to stop and reflect.
We're intellectual, emotional creatures. To learn the skills necessary, one has to have both a healthy internal life and external life. And so being self-aware of that is really critical.
First of all, we have to learn how to manage our stress ourselves.
How to deal with stress. In today's society where everything just seems to go 90 miles an hour, you have to just take a time out yourself.
I mean, it's important to be shown to him that there's different ways to deal with stressful situations.
Teach them how to deal with emotions.
Like, did we give them the skills to be able to handle conflict or resolve conflict?
When kids are able to process their own feelings, acknowledge what's going on with others around them, not only for others, but for oneself, right? Forgiveness and what led to this? How might I do this differently?
They have to have a sense of empathy. They have to have respect for other people, other cultures.
I want him to learn how to interact with other kids, how to play, how to cooperate, how to do things together, also have fun.
I think that has been the best thing with my relationship with my daughter, that she's able to communicate well with others, speak her feelings.
That's important because the world around us is all about relationships. Our children need to be able to guide themselves through there so that they can achieve those things that they need to achieve and be able to communicate them effectively.
I'm always thinking about how are we potentially impacting students in a way that will make them think twice? Like, how are we helping them make good decisions?
He's starting to understand that why do one thing instead of another and how it affects other people. Explaining to him his actions have influence on his quality of life.
I think our children need to be able to be confident enough to articulate what they're feeling and to be able to just showcase their strengths.
Those 5 competencies apply to being successful anywhere. That's the kind of employee I'd like to work with. That's the kind of student that I'd like to have in my classroom. That's the kind of person I'd like to study with after school.
And that helps build a positive climate and environment that sets the tone for.
All right. So I'm going to move us on to talk about some social emotional learning strategies for families at home. Now, all these strategies come from different resources, and we will be sharing out after the program a resource guide that is translated both in English and in Portuguese so folks can look at these resources themselves. So the first strategy for SEL at home is to play every day. Every child should experience safe and healthy play, and there are many activities that can get kids moving while teaching them social emotional skills that are essential to helping kids combat stress and anxiety associated with the pandemic. Establish household and remote school rules and procedures. Establishing procedures for managing health, learning new content, building relationships, and growing self-awareness and emotion management skills can help families and students who are learning at home. And then finally, an interesting suggestion is to build a family charter. So the charter can be a written document detailing how everybody in your home wants to feel. You can do this for yourself as parents or as an entire family. And if you have children, depending on their age, they may need help with the writing part, but even young kids can share how they want to feel at home. The next strategy is to enhance and practice executive function skills. Executive function and self-regulation skills provide critical supports for learning and development. There are many developmentally appropriate activities for families to strengthen various components of their child's executive function. Engage in creativity together. Examples of creativity in action include cooking or baking, doing puzzles, coloring or art projects, playing board games, writing a poem or song together. And then finally, model the behavior you seek. Children mirror what they see their family doing, including the behaviors and relationships between family members. Don't forget to foster self-esteem in your children by giving them responsibilities, allowing them to make age-appropriate choices, and showing your appreciation to them. In particular, in our resource guide, we have many links to different places that allow for more detailed information about the specific activities that are listed on these slides. Finally, don't go it alone. Reach out to your child's teacher and school leader to ask for tips and tricks to implement social emotional learning at home, and utilize resources online like the following to find what you're most comfortable doing with your child at home. Places like CASEL's Parent SEL resources, University of Illinois Chicago's Parent Resources, EduTopia's Parent Guide to Social and Emotional Learning, and the Parent Academy all provide great resources for families to use at home. And again, we have put together a resource guide for families translated into Portuguese and English of all the resources featured in this presentation. And this guide will be released after the event. So feel free to check out the Senate President's website after the event. And we can send more information out in the chat on that. So now I'm going to transition to close out my presentation, answer a few audience questions that we got with the registration links, as well as any live audience questions that are sent my way. If you would like to learn more about the Rennie Center and our back to school blueprints and action guides, please feel free to visit our website. In particular, the Rennie Center's Family Guide to Remote Learning offers great tips and tricks to understand if you're being supported and how to support your children's learning at home. So I'm going to answer a couple questions that we got, and then my team will maybe be sending me a couple questions in the chat. So one of the questions we received is about how to support social and emotional learning for adults. And social emotional learning isn't just for students. Adults are in great need of understanding the systems in which they operate, how they impact those systems, and how they are impacted by the systems. Adults are living and breathing just like their students are. And in order to build a learning environment that supports student SEL and well-being, adults need opportunities to reflect on their own social, emotional, and cultural competencies, practice self-care. So for example, taking a mindfulness minute, creating a self-care kit, keeping a journal, and taking a walk, anything to allow adults to process and understand the emotions of what's going on, in particular in this increased traumatic time during the pandemic. One of the other ones that we received was about the impact of trauma and the pandemic on communities of color. Culturally responsive practices and teachers that reflect the student body are really key to allow our students and families to understand the impact that their identity that race has on students, on families. And so it's really important to understand the increased discrimination of students of color and their families during this time, and connect students and reach out to families in ways in which they'll understand. So if families don't have access to internet, think through how you're going to reach out to families and support them in this time, and allow for constant communication and check-ins to really see and ask families what supports they need. Another question we received is a question on how to have a healthy transition to in-person school. So again, at the Rennie Center, we have released 7 action guides over the summer for educators and school leaders to help support them as they return to school. And in these, you can find resources on topics like helping students heal from trauma, rebuilding community, accessing grade level content, re-engaging students, and more. And these topics don't just apply over the summer into the fall, they apply throughout the school year as well. So I'm seeing some questions in the chat from my team. I know, Annalise, I saw you hop on. Is there anything that I should be addressing right now?
Yeah, so we've gotten a lot of fantastic questions. So thank you to all of you who have submitted some questions for Sophie. And we will get through as many as we can. Know that some of the questions you've asked are actually going to be answered by our panel. So if we're holding off on them right now, that is why. One question we got, Sophie, is during your presentation, you spoke to asset-based communication. And we have an audience member just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what does asset-based communication look like?
Absolutely. So in order to kind of define asset-based, we need to think of the other hand, which is deficit-based. So what we're really proponents of at the Rennie Center and throughout schools is to utilize positive affirmational communication that doesn't put blame on or talk negatively about a student situation, but instead asks, how can we help? How can we support you? What sort of structures and systems are in place at home, at school, that aren't allowing the students to succeed, rather than saying, why is your student not doing this? Why are they not doing their homework? Why are they not showing up to school? What's wrong with them? It's really turning that communication into something positive and asking how the school and teachers can support students and support families to allow them to have a healthy, comfortable experience at school.
Fantastic. Yeah. And really appreciate that, Sophie. Another question we got in the chat is really relates to what you were talking about with transformative SEL, and sort of how transformative SEL in a lot of ways kind of flips traditional SEL on its head by recognizing some of the issues that have been part of traditional SEL. So we have someone asking, how are we teaching SEL or teaching families about SEL in a way that's explicitly anti-racist and doesn't kind of bring in that white supremacy culture that can be so damaging in this type of instruction?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's very relevant right now in the wake of the pandemic and of increased understanding of racial inequities. And one of the things that kind of plays along with this asset base is really thinking about how do we expand on the traditional social emotional learning competencies, which put a lot of ownership on the individual, on the student themselves, to regulate their own behavior, to understand their own identity, and make good decisions, and really think about the environment that surrounds them and how we can collectively come together to support students. We've all heard the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And in this case, it really does take a village. And transformative social emotional learning really makes sure that we are all thinking about, as a collective, how do we come together to understand each other's identities and experiences and support children and understand what they need based on their experience, based on their home situation, based on how they are at school, to really think about how we can support them rather than how they can do everything for themselves. Because we know that our relationships are so important, and building those strong relationships at school allows a student to feel more comfortable and to thrive in education and really achieve the success that they define for themselves. All right. I don't want to take up too much more time, and we're getting close to be able to switch to the panel. Are there any final questions, Annalise, that you have seen from the audience that I can answer right now?
No, I think a number of the questions that have come in, we're actually going to direct towards our panelists. So thank you so much, Sophie, for your presentation. And now it is my enormous pleasure to introduce the panelists that we have with us today. Senate President Spilka, up at the top of our conversation this morning, gave you a bit about your background and their bios. And I'll also note that in our program for today, their full bios are listed just so you can see the enormous scope of our three panelists' accomplishments. But we're just so grateful to have these community leaders with us today who can really talk to what does effective social emotional learning instruction and trauma-informed practice look like in our schools and our communities. So as a quick reminder, we have three panelists with us this morning. We have Katie Brown, who's the transition coordinator at Natick High School, John Crocker, who's the director of school mental health and behavioral services at Methuen Public Schools, and Tiffany Lilly, who's the director of the Office of Community Resource Development at Framingham Public Schools. So I want to give a warm welcome to each of our three panelists this morning and ask that each of you join us on video at this point. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. So what we're going to do is kick off our panel this morning with one question directed to each of our panelists. Then we're going to ask a question of all of them before we open it up to you all in the audience. So please get questions ready that you may have for them as they're talking. All right, so what we're going to do is start off with a question for you, Tiffany. And what we'd love to hear is in your holistic approach to serving students both inside and outside of the school day, how do you balance academic programming alongside social and emotional supports?
Thank you, Annalise. So our department oversees all the out-of-school time programming for the district beyond the school bell, as we like to refer to it. And I think it's a lot of the pieces that Sophie touched on in her presentation. I really think for us, it's starting at the ground level of relationship building and just making sure that it's not transactional and that it's really rooted in a strength-based approach. That's the biggest piece around the work that we're moving as a district towards anti-racism and health and wellness, social emotional learning, is to really take a moment to say, what's our intention versus what's our impact? And I think that it's critical to kind of having the whole school day, right? Because even though our department lives beyond the bell, it's a full day approach. And we have, a true privilege being part of the school district to make sure that there's alignment, and not only between our programs, but alignment with community partners. So when I talk about relationship building, I mean it on every level. So with students, with parents, with partners, with stakeholders, and that piece makes it multi-pronged. And I think that that's where we really need to be going, because with SEL practices and all of those things, it's easy to say, hey, how can you adjust to fit our norms, right? And I think this has to be in response to COVID, a true moment of introspection and saying, this is not about us asking everyone else to catch up or everyone else to get on our page. It's about what do we need to change within our own practices to meet people where they're at and to meet our families and our students where they're at. And I think it's hard, right? It's hard on a daily basis to say, I'm going to keep adapting and I'm going to keep changing. And our team has a joke that the word of the year is like pivot. And that's real. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think we really have to keep responding to that. And so definitely starting with relationship building on all fronts. And, from our school day staff, what we saw last fall when our teachers were remote and our community partners, as well as our department was running remote learning centers, was that communication more than ever before with school day teachers. Hey, you have this in your Google Classroom, I'm supporting a student, and it has to be granular. I think we have to be willing to be super detailed and go deep. I think that's it's sometimes easier to have a lot of higher level conversations and with partners, and that always is helpful for, all of our structures. But we have to have everyone in on the conversation of like, what's the next step to go in programming and support students and families at every level. And so, yeah, I think for us, it's just an integrated approach, making sure that it's not transactional and that we're checking in, right? Like that was a big thing for us during remote learning centers and even now planning summer programs. Our whole team is being very cautious to not say, summer school is going to fix everything, because it's not. And if students struggles with academics all year long, we have to make sure that our programs are considering their emotional needs, their needs for friendship, and their needs for play, and really integrating those in programs that are responsive. And that it's not a Band-Aid. If we're really trying to address the needs of students, we're trying to do it on a systemic level, and listening to them first, in my opinion, is really where we're going to see that growth.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Thank you.
It just strikes me that, in the research world, we talk about how the effectiveness of social emotional learning really comes in when it's systemic. And so much of this work lives with adults. And I think your answer there of just like the reflection and the pieces that adults take on in order to create, what we're looking for, really ultimately impacting students, just really fantastic to hear. So thank you. All right, well, I'm going to shift over to a question that we have for Katie. So Katie, in some of our past work at the Rennie Center, we've highlighted your profile of a graduate work, which articulates the core elements that high school graduates should understand and develop. So we'd love to hear a bit more about how do competencies like executive function, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills factor into that profile of a graduate?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think when we developed the profile of the graduate a few years ago, boy, we had a really long list as a group of colleagues coming together and thinking about the skills we wanted our students to graduate with. The skills you want for every student. I'm thinking if you can go back to kindergarten and you can dream about what your adult child, what skills they'll have. We had a really long list. And we kept breaking it down, and it's still happening. But we really focused on being a lifelong learner, responsible decision-making, and a citizen leader as being the three kind of core areas to focus on. Lifelong learner, that encompasses all the tenets of somebody who has knowledge and curiosity about what they're able to learn, right? All the things you would expect of a student. So nothing in that list was really unusual. It's about analysis and deeper level thinking and critical thinking and on writing and reading and math and all those things we want our students to have. So really the bulk of our work, which is the connection to the SEL part, came down to the responsible decision maker and the citizen leader. So I can think about the responsible decision maker, and they both encompass all of those pieces of what I like to think of in the special education world, what we call self-determination. So self-determination is, for what everybody else knows, is like self-regulation. It encompasses executive functioning skills, but it kind of takes it to the next level. So something we focused on is creating this framework so that it becomes a systemic change. So it's not enough to give teachers one more thing to do without the reason, right? We want our teachers to be impassioned by SEL. We want them to see the difference it will make long-term, not today, not on that test, not on that quiz, but the forever change it could have at a student. So we wanted to create a framework and a common language so that we could make this gradual systemic change. And it has to be gradual. It has to be with every person you're hiring. These are maybe the questions you're now asking about how they see embedding this into their learning. But it also comes back to how we're empowering students. And I really think about responsible decision-making. how are we enabling students to be what I like to call the causal agents in their own lives? And here in Natick, we've done a really great job of thinking of through that lens. And this year in particular, that's been really challenging. But how do we take students to have them have that self-awareness? How do we help them investigate themselves, be able to, have communication with others that's respectful and full of empathy? How do we have them accept feedback and constructive criticism and move past it and make a change for themselves? All of those things really need to be explicitly taught. It doesn't mean you're having a class devoted to it either, by the way. It means that it's happening in science class, it's happening in math class, it's happening in physical education and wellness, it's happening in Spanish, it's happening everywhere. But the teacher and the staff has the lens of, okay, today I'm going to teach this lesson. And oh, by the way, the other benefit is I'm making the student responsible for their learning. A big part of my job, which is probably my favorite job, is working with students and families to help figure out what's coming next. And one of the questions I always ask students is about their self-awareness. And it's interesting to me that a student who, if I say, do you think you're self-aware? The student who generally says, oh yeah, I'm really aware. When I dig deeper and use some of my tools of self-awareness, that student is often not self-aware. It's actually the student who says, I'm not so sure I'm self-aware. What do you mean by that? That's the student who actually is self-aware because they're already curious about themselves. They've already opened up their mind that they might not know something or that there's new information out there. So all of these things play into SEL, right? So I think about how you take feedback from others and how this person who we're developing this, with families, we're part of that partnership of graduates, people going out into the adult world, feeling confident, feeling motivated, feeling like they're the causal agent. We interviewed 300 local area employers about what they thought were the most important skills for the employees. And they said their priorities were demonstrating personal integrity, honesty, and ethical behavior, right? So these are all the same things we're talking about. There's other research out there from Google that says actually it's empathy and conversation taking. So how are we working on those things right now is really challenging when we have an experience of students not being in the building all the time. I think that COVID has kind of shown a spotlight on the areas that we are really good at, right? Project-based learning, giving kids more decision-making because they're at home, actually making them put into power their executive functioning skills because we were doing a lot of those things for them before. It's also shown a spotlight on the students who are really struggling. And they were making it through last year because we were holding their hand in the building every day. So I do think there's some lessons to be learned from this time in this past 300 and how many days, 67, 68, about what we need to do better in the future and how we really help the kids who are struggling right now. I can see already my numbers raising, especially for our seniors who thought they knew what they wanted for next year, and suddenly they are panicked. And their families are panicked. The world is different than we thought it would be a year and a half ago. And how do we help those families and hold their hands? As a district, we're really focused on that. But again, I think it's a systemic change.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Katie. And I think, so much of what you just talked about draws back to where Sophie was speaking of empowerment and what that is, and this shift towards this transformative notion of self. So really appreciate just hearing about that great work you're doing. So now a question for John, and I think this is one we get quite a lot. You've championed really comprehensive school mental health practices in Methuen. Really, the district has become a real leader in this field. And folks would love to know some simple strategies that you would recommend for educators and parents who are just starting out with these types of supports.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to talk a little bit broadly first, about comprehensive school mental health systems and like, what is that? Really, we're talking about services and supports for all students. Not every student is going to require therapeutic supports, but every single student needs help navigating their social environment, accessing support services, understanding how to resolve conflict, understanding how to ultimately navigate their world in an effective way and manage stress. So I think that we're talking about supports for everyone and more intensive supports for some of our students. The first thing I'll say about, what do we need to do now? How do we need to orient to the growing needs of our kids? We have to invest. We have to invest time and energy and funding into evidence-based therapeutic care in schools, into social emotional learning being explicitly taught. I think that ultimately, I've seen in the question and answer questions around like, should we invest in mental health staff? And my thought is absolutely. I think that it's an essential step to take to be able to ensure that all of our students can receive the care that they need. But beyond the investment in mental health staff, I think we have to invest in orienting schools to comprehensive social emotional learning curriculum and also evidence-based therapeutic supports, and explicitly dedicating time for students to be able to access these things. It's all well and good to say that we care about mental health. It's another thing to actually do something about it. So from just a broad investment standpoint, that's what I think needs to happen next. From a practical standpoint for teachers and parents, maybe some strategies that can help with like, what do we do right now? One thing I'll say is that emotionally distressed and dysregulated students are not ready to learn. We need to ensure that we're tending to our students' emotional needs before we start to challenge them with engaging in high quality academic instruction. So investment in the emotional safety and well-being of our kids is going to result in academic success. Also, emotionally dysregulated students are not ready for consequence and discipline. We have to ultimately pump the brakes when we're working with students, resolve the problem at hand, help them to get to an emotionally balanced place. And then afterwards, yes, this is not to say that consequence and discipline is not a thing that can happen, but it really should not happen in that critical crisis moment. I want to talk about a couple cycles that I think it's worth discussing, because I think our attempts to assist students sometimes reinforce these cycles. So Katie, this one's for you, and the question and answer for sure. I saw one of your questions around this decision about, my students remote right now, what do I do? There's this anxiety about going back to school. So we want to avoid the avoidance cycle. Ultimately, a stressful situation that we avoid ultimately gives us temporary relief. We feel good about it, right? We don't have to deal with the thing. But what that does is it reinforces the idea that you couldn't have addressed that situation, you couldn't have gotten through that situation, and the next time that you have to deal with it, you're going to avoid again. So breaking that cycle, when we're talking about a stressful situation that is not actually damaging, that is not a dangerous stressful situation, but one that we want to foster in our kids, like going to school, even though it's a little bit stressful, or taking a test, even though it's a little bit stressful. We need to coach our students through that and not reinforce the avoidance, not keep them home, not say, well, you don't have to take this test, you don't have to do this assignment. It's more about explicitly talking to them about what are the strategies that we need to engage in to coach the student through it, to help them to realize that they can find success with this, and to challenge their thinking around this thought that they maybe can't engage in this activity. Another cycle that I think everyone's really familiar with is this idea of isolation and inactivity, and how that can lead to situations where some of our students who are experiencing depression enter into this cycle, and it's reinforced because their connections are lost and they are no longer able to draw upon positive experiences. So I guess I would say, please make sure that we don't equate social distancing with social isolation. We have to foster activity with our kids and make sure that they have outlets to be able to engage socially. A couple other things, this was mentioned before, routines, rituals, and expectations. Our kids need that. They need some sense of normalcy as they try to navigate through this very difficult time. I think we should foster help-seeking behavior for our kids. We need to leave our assumptions at the door around whether or not they need help. Some students come to the table with different pre-existing conditions and experience stress in different ways. So we have to just be ready for providing care to all our kids. And then lastly, I'll just say, one thing very easy that we can all do for our kids is to promote critical thinking skills. You can't hurt a kid with cognitive behavioral therapy. Rational, balanced, logical thinking leads to emotional regulation, better behavior, and ultimately better outcomes. But I think that that's a charge for everyone. We can all foster critical thinking skills. And ultimately, when we don't provide the mental health services and supports, the social emotional learning opportunities that our kids need, they don't ultimately achieve the outcomes that we want for them academically or socially, and that they deserve. So we need to make that investment.
Thank you, John. Those are all such helpful tips. And I think, that point you made at the end is one we've been hearing a lot. Like, there's sometimes this perceived dichotomy between focusing on academics or focusing on students' social emotional needs, both of which are so critical coming out of this pandemic. But I think how you just braided this together shares like these things are forever linked, and we need to be looking at both of them for students to really reach their potential and have that sense of agency and all of these things that we're looking for. So thank you so much for that. So what I'm going to do now is ask one question to all of our panelists, if you all want to come back on video, and then we're going to shift into the Q&A that we've received from our audience, and we have a lot of wonderful questions rolling in. So this question for our panelists is a hard one. In one sentence, we'd love to hear what you see as the keys to helping students, families, and communities re-engage with the education system in a way that rebuilds trust and pushes the system forward, rather than going to this inequitable normal from, before COVID-19. And really hearing, where does social emotional learning play a role in this trust building process?
I'll gladly go first. Hard to do in one sentence, Annalise.
Maybe impossible. If you have to use a few sentences, okay. I think that's okay.
I think we have to balance offering our students and families grace with accountability. And I think it goes exactly off what John was saying. We've asked our families and students and staff to be so flexible, but there's a point that you can flex someone till they break. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge, and it's not like the parade of, oh, it's been hard. Yeah, but we need to acknowledge it on a really personal level with individual students and with individual families, how hard this has been, and make a plan, right? An actual plan of how to re-engage with trust. You can't just say you want it to happen and make a wish. It's not going to work. So an actual plan using all of our staff, supporting everybody, not just one more demand. But I think we need to have a plan of how we build this trust again. And it's going to take a while, no doubt.
Thank you, Kate.
I'll jump in. I guess I'll try to keep it to one sentence, but I like to talk. So I think that ultimately we need to foster emotional, physical, and academic safety as students return. We need to foster their emotional safety such that they are feeling like they can seek out help and that their emotions are validated. We need to make sure that they're safe from a health standpoint and a physical standpoint so that they want to come to school. And ultimately, we need to be very generous with our flexibility around their academic readiness right now, and make it okay to make mistakes from an academic standpoint, and know that that's not going to be something that goes unnoticed or unmet in terms of our response in a supportive way.
I couldn't agree more with Katie and John. And I think the element that I would add to both of those is all staff, from policymakers to administrators to teachers, really have to think through this work through an anti-racism lens. I think that, you know, the SEL is the plate. I would say anti-racism is the placemat, the table, the, you know, all of the things. I think we cannot ignore the systemic oppression that school departments and school districts can perpetuate. And it is all of the oppression that marginalized communities have experienced during this have only been exacerbated. And we would be remiss if we did not address at the core those pieces, and that, you know, the work of health and wellness, social emotional learning has to really live through that lens, and that we have to look at it through a strength-based approach. Really what John and Katie talked about, right? Like, it's not about having everyone, the students change for us or the parents change. It's how are we reflecting on our practices to shift.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I think, you know, what you all just shared just goes back to the core of the presentation that Sophie shared with us, that this shift towards this transformative notion of SEL, we talked about it, or as Tiffany was just sharing, this anti-racist SEL is so core to the work of schools in this moment. And we've got some more questions that kind of relate to this piece. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open it up to questions that we've been getting from the audience. Some of these questions are ones that you all submitted when you registered for the event. Others are questions we've been getting in the Q&A, and we're going to answer as many as possible. So one question that's come up from a few folks is about relationships between families and schools. So a question I'd love just to bring to the full panel is, how do we generate strong relationships between schools and families to support social and emotional learning?
I can take a pass. I think it's really listening to a lot of our community partners and a lot of our actual families. A lot of our partners are doing this work in our communities of the basic needs that families need, as well as some of the advanced needs. And I think that we have to be really cautious to really align with community partners during this time to make sure that our work for families is all aligned. And I think we just have to listen first. I really feel that we, you know, it feels like there's a sense of urgency, and there is, and we want to jump into action. But I also think that this is a moment of just reflecting around, what do families need? What kind of communication strategies are going to be helpful for them? Are we listening to them? And what do they need, whether it's phone calls or text messages, or like from the technical communication standpoints to how is that informing our practice is, I think, critical.
I think I'll just add on to that, because I think this has obviously been said in the past hour over and over again, but we really need to come at the approach with us really treating families, schools need to treat families like partners. And I know that doesn't always feel that way for a family. And when I'm working with a student who I can see is having a challenge in school, I need to know what's going on at home, because the family might not be seeing that, or they might not be able to identify what I'm seeing. I have a different perspective. And the same thing when a family sees something happening at home, to inform the school and have their point person. I think having a point person is really important. And that person communicates to the team who works with that student. But I think we need each other. And that's how we need to support each other, obviously, but we need each other because the information that we're getting might be different.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, it certainly resonates. We've at the Rennie Center done some research with schools during this time and have heard over and over again just how COVID has created this kind of reliance on each other in a way that's even more than it was previously. You know, in the time when school closed and most schools were in distant learning as some shift back to hybrid and things like that, but just the role of families in teaching was just brought into the forefront for everyone, where it may not have been as obvious when schools were operating fully kind of in that pre-COVID world, and just bringing this forward and not losing the momentum of this time in that really deep partnership is so critical. Great. So another question we've gotten, and I think this is one that's come up quite a bit, is that a lot of public schools across Massachusetts are planning summer school in order to kind of remediate some of that distance learning loss, but children are feeling burnt out with school. So what's the best option to address social and emotional needs as well as close the learning gap this summer? And I know this is a tough question and there are no simple answers to a question like this.
I'll throw out my thoughts. I think it's definitely going to draw upon what I talked about previously, but given that burnout, given the incredible influx in prevalence rates around anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress, I think that we have to invest first in our kids' well-being. We can't just assume that we can maybe now, after a year of intense isolation and inactivity and stress, that we head back to school and the time where students seek solace, we're going to use that and pump academics and it's just going to go well. Do I think we can leverage that to some degree? Sure. But my hope would be that we're leveraging that with knowledge that we have to invest in the well-being of our kids alongside their academic growth and achievement, because again, a precursor to their ability to make academic gains is that they are emotionally ready to learn. If they're not ready to learn, then no amount of trying to instruct them is going to help.
Thank you, John.
I would also add that this is like in the world of out of school time, I feel like they're ready, like all of our partners, at least the ones that I'm working with in Framingham, like they are beyond up for this challenge, from the YMCAs to the Hoops and Homework, all the organizations are really staying abreast. They were the first ones in doing remote learning centers. Like they really understand at a deep level what students have been facing through all of it, right? Like I was laughing, our team was like, okay, we're going to do full day remote learning centers. Now we're going to do vacation weeks. Now we're going to do before and after school. Like there's the relationships, like they haven't been remote, I guess, for partners, And so I think that that's really important, is that partners have been on the ground the entire time. And I think the other piece is just listening to students. That's like in all of our programs, we're listening to students. What do you want? What do you need? And sometimes trying to inform what they also need. And so creating transitional programming, like if students, we had some middle school students say, I've been playing video games like 20 hours a week. And I'm like, okay, how can I got to figure out a way to work this into our summer programs, because to like starkly cut someone off from an interest or passion that they have, that's not realistic. And we really want to maintain the engagement. So, looking at DESE's esports recommendations and things like that to make sure that our programs are informed by what students want, as well as what we may identify their needs are academically, and then totally infusing all of that with health and wellness, social emotional learning. That means that we're adding to our budgets with guidance counselors and social workers, and we're working with our partners on mental health programming. Like it means everything, I think, but I really feel like our out of school time providers are ready and they're equipped and they're excited about this work, and not, it's not going to be, at least I think confidently in Framingham, it's not going to be just come bring your books and you're going to be in front of a teacher for 6 hours a day learning. It really is going to be a blend.
I would add to what both Tiffany and John said, that something that actually keeps me up at night is because I see it in the adults that, in my world, not just teachers, but friends. How do we socially engage? We're social beings, and we haven't been allowed to be for a year now. And for a lot of students, they need that explicit instruction of how to be social again, how to work in a group, how to take turns in conversation, how to show somebody you're listening to them. And so how can we throw them back into a classroom with academic expectations, like John said, even if they don't feel like maybe there's been any trauma in the past year? How do we rebuild those skills first? I think that's the highest priority, because if you don't have those, if you can't socially adapt to being in a school building all day, then the rest is really out the window. It's not going to happen. That's the underlying, that's like the, you know, the base of it all. So I would say for summer programming, maybe yes, embedding some academics as necessary, but really that should not be the goal.
Thanks, Katie. And it certainly resonates, I think, what both of you just shared with research we know within the school space, that when time is taken at the beginning of the school year to really build relationships with students and make sure they feel welcome and safe and comfortable in their schools, we really see wonderful things happen academically with that deliberate sort of non-academic seeming investment up front. So I think that certainly resonates there. Another question we got is, during COVID-19, we know that mental health needs and trauma has escalated. Do you all feel that we need more training and additional staff to support mental health? And if you could advocate for any new roles to address mental health concerns or additions to already established roles, what would that look like? I think, Tiffany, you alluded to this for sure in your last response.
Yeah, I think we have been talking about that at the district level, and for us, our superintendent is also, you know, a huge advocate and really spearheading a lot of our work around health and wellness and social emotional learning. And this year, we're going to be adding wraparound coordinator positions managed through our Office of Equity and Community Development. And that work is really around, you know, we have social emotional coaches, we have guidance counselors and social workers, and they're able to do a lot of the work in the building, but a lot of the needs that we're seeing are outside of the building. And we are coordinating food distribution and toiletries and all of these things. And that is what we're seeing as the need. And so we're really excited about these wraparound coordinators that are, you know, it's a model that's evidence-based in other districts. And that is one of the strategies that we're responding to the pandemic with, and trying to really have folks that are doing some of the non-traditional work that you don't always get to do when you're part of the school day.
Absolutely. John, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, I think we need more staff for sure, wholesale, but not just more staff. I think we need to effectively leverage the staff that we have. There does need to be a heavy investment in effective professional development for our current staff to raise the level of readiness such that evidence-based therapeutic care is not just coming from an outside community partner. I think we're incredibly uniquely positioned as schools to look for emerging mental health concerns and to address those concerns in a preventative and proactive way. The average wait time for a kid to get services nationally after they start to experience symptoms is 8 to 10 years. That is absolutely absurd. But the reason for that is because we as a mental health system writ large are oriented to diagnosis and crisis, unfortunately. So we need to get better at identifying kids early and providing those services in a proactive, preventative way. What does that mean? It means an investment in mental health systems that are embedded in schools and that are delivered by school-based staff. It's not an either or, it's a both and, because we need our community partners. I love what Tiffany's talking about in terms of also addressing social influencers of health and education, you know, food insecurity, housing insecurity, but building capacity within schools, getting the right staffing, and ensuring that they're trained up to be able to provide evidence-based care, that's essential.
Absolutely.
I would add that, similar again to John and Tiffany, that I think I look at our social work staff, guidance counselors, school psychologists, really they're the ones, they're kind of the ones in the mud, right? They're doing the hard work, the day-to-day work with students. But if we're thinking about systemic change, you know, we need training for all staff, and it can't be a 2-hour professional development on a Wednesday afternoon once a year. That is not enough. We have staff here begging for help, wanting to learn more, but to have, and it's not about taking another grad class. You know, it's about that person in your building or persons who are just there. Their job is to support the staff. They're there to support the teachers on how to work through this day-to-day work in your classroom with families. I think we put so much on our counseling staff the weight on them is enormous. And staff need support too, by the way. They need social emotional support. They need somebody to talk to who's doing the same thing they're doing, experiencing the same thing, so that they can be better for our students and families. And it can't be a referral to an outside agency. We need people who are in the building. That would be my pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got a question, and this is actually one I think at the Rennie Center that certainly resonates, because it's one we hear from districts that we work with sometimes. Someone wrote that their high school is struggling with buy-in from educators on SEL, sort of feeling like it's one more thing rather than something to be embedded into existing work. And what tips could you all share about, how to get that buy-in from staff around social emotional learning?
I'll offer a couple of thoughts. One, we've really tried to adopt a bifurcated approach to delivery of SEL, such that it's explicit curriculum, but it's also instructional practice. And I think especially at the high school level, where taking time away from content can sometimes be seen as disruptive, even though it's not. We need to invest in the explicit instruction around SEL. But I think an easy way to start with SEL for maybe a district that is entering into this work is investment in instructional practice. So it's less about replacing the content, and it's more about how you deliver the content such that you are fostering social emotional competence. I would point to the CASTLE 3 Signature Practices Playbook as a really great example, and also the Facing History in Ourselves teaching strategies. These are things that are just good instructional practices, and they can be dropped into any content area, and they happen to foster social emotional competence.
Fantastic. Thank you.
To add one thing, I also
Yeah.
just a really big moment and opportunity for youth leadership and youth voice to be at the core of this. And I think especially at the high school level, like I know speaking from our high school perspective, we have so many clubs that are engaged in this work, really leveraging students to, take on the conversation and pilot initiatives. And I think a lot of the success of this work is happening in pockets and then kind of scaling. And I think that, we really, this is an opportunity to engage youth voice in the process.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tiffany, for sharing that. Thank you, John. It reminds me of some amazing work I've heard of recently with the, grade 8 civic standards that came out a few years ago, where youth are leading these civic action projects, and how that is such a clear example of how SEL comes into really this youth-led work that is also directly tied to academic gains and academic standards. So thank you. So another great question we got: what resources or networks exist that you all know of for piloting and incubating new programs for youth, especially at a time when high school administrators and teachers are feeling overwhelmed? Not just high school administrators, really. I would argue all educators are certainly feeling that right now.
I can try. I know that there's a lot of organizations that are doing, at least in the out of school time world. So the National After School Association has, think tanks and affinity groups. And I think Mass After School Partnership is doing some of this work. DESE's 21st Century Community Learning Center networks are having think tanks. We had one on family engagement just the other day. And then I would say like a lot of mine is just like my networks, like I know Emily over at Salem, and I'm like, what are you doing for this? And I think that, picking up the phone and calling anyone that will take my call. And John and Katie, I'm adding you now to my list, but that really is part of it. And not just people that have the same position as you, but people that have a totally different position and building those spaces. So I'm happy to always talk to someone. I think that we're only better when we're doing this work collectively. And also just, I think, we're really lucky, again, to have a superintendent and a school committee that's very supportive, but we've got to try different things and just be willing to try it and say, hey, we're all going to take a risk here, but we're hoping, we're going to monitor it and all those things. But we work in education and we have to model for students just as like what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to take risks and, be adventurous learners. We've got to do it too, I think. So.
Yeah, I mean, that piece about shared learning and, work across districts is just so powerful, because we hear all the time about phenomenal things happening and we're like, wow, everyone should know about this, but really like fostering those connections, not just within your community, but across communities is a really fantastic example.
So I can add to that, Annalise. I just want to say something that we've been successful with here. Well, I'll say that I've enjoyed is partnering with the local universities and their research projects, because they're taking things to the next level. First of all, they have the time and the resources to do it, but having your public school and your community participate and these research projects it's going to, first of all, turn on the light on something you might not have been aware of. And it's going to give you resources you didn't have access to before. It's going to connect you to people as well, as Tiffany was saying. So that would be one suggestion, is partnering with local universities. And certainly we have a lot of them. Another thing would be through DESE. Later this year, I'm doing 2 DESE presentations on different topics, one similar to this, one on self-determination. And it's actually for the DESE staff, because they want to know more. Because if they know more, then they can support our schools more. They know what questions to ask. They know when they're walking through the building, what they should be looking for. So I think we can think high up. We can think high. I think you can think, like Tiffany said too, who are your people? I have a group of transition coordinators. It's a state group. Those are my people. We have monthly meetings. We have an online group. We use each other as resources nonstop to think outside the box, to push us, to make connections. And I think that staff and schools need to feel embodied to do those things.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, Katie, I really, both of you, Tiffany, Katie, I really appreciate that stance around like reach out, network, cross talk across different districts. I'll throw this on the table, like join the consortium. It's free. It's shared resources, free training, PD. We just want to help individuals to implement quality school mental health for kids. That's all it's about. So I think networks like that, I know from Rennie, the Excel network has been something that we've really enjoyed being a part of. And these learning communities exist, the DESE academies, the opportunity to be able to get coaching and training to support this work, but you got to kind of reach out, right? So.
Great. Well, I just want to extend an enormous thank you to John, to Tiffany, to Katie, for all that you've shared today. You bring just such a wealth of insight, just for all of us to learn from. So those are our final questions for the panel. And I know that Sophie is also adding some links to the chat, and some of you may have some questions that were answered in the Q&A. And at this point, we're going to bring Senate President Spilka back onto screen with us to answer a final question. So Senate President, we've heard so many really serious issues today, both from the questions that we got in the chat, from Sophie's presentation, and just from the wealth of insight that John, Katie, and Tiffany shared with us. So we're hoping that you could tell us, how are state policymakers working to address these issues?
Thank you, Annalise, for that question. It's a great question, one that I can answer because it is really critical. What are the ways where we as a state policymakers, lawmakers are responding to what is really a crisis right now, I would say, across schools and many families. We've tried to do it, sort of approach it from different directions in different ways. And I do want to start out by saying, if anybody who is on this right now or who listens to it in the future, please contact my office, contact your state senator. We want to do as much as possible. So let us know where there are gaps and we will work on it, literally work on it. Some of the things that we've been doing, and as I said in the introduction, this is a personal issue to me. So since I've been in the legislature, mental health, behavioral health has been a real focus for me, and specifically to build up existing programs and services, to start new programs and services, to fill gaps that I hear about. Working with advocates, with school personnel, with parents. So in the latest budget, the Senate in particular took aim at student access to mental health supports in a number of ways. First, we designated $3.5 million for a new program to improve a student's ability to access telebehavioral mental health services, mostly during school. We know that while students are studying remotely, they have to have every opportunity to engage with school counselors or other social and emotional support persons. I actually proposed this before the pandemic, but since the pandemic, the acute need of these services have really come out so full and so strongly for our students' well-being. Another issue is the workforce pipeline. All the panelists just recently talked about the workforce. We need to attract more people, more talented people to join mental health professions. So for this, the most recent state budget introduced a $1.8 million program, which will help community centers to recruit more mental health nurse practitioners. And that includes money to mental health staff themselves. A key component of getting strong mental health and behavioral health workforce is having professionals who are diverse. We need to have a diverse workforce, culturally, ethnically, linguistically, all aspects of diverse. So we put another $250,000 towards specifically attracting new mental health professionals who are diverse in these areas. We also put $100,000 towards making sure that our existing mental health professionals are culturally competent to support people from differing backgrounds. I do want to mention when we did the Student Opportunity Act last session, which was one of my biggest pushes and why I ran for the legislature initially, I pushed hard to include an increased factor within the formula itself so that more funding would flow to school districts to increase the number of social workers, guidance counselors, and others dealing with this field, exactly as Tiffany, Katie, and John mentioned. We still need to do more. I realize we're not anywhere near where we should be. We tightened the rules covering insurance on mental health care to cover services received on the same day. Believe it or not, if you got physical health and mental health, the mental health did not need to be covered, which meant a lot of providers weren't necessarily providing it, when it was so necessary. Again, these are just the most recent add-ons in the state budget and the Student Opportunity Act. And all of this comes on more than $10 million in the budget. I created a new annual trust fund. The Senate did it in its budget. It survived conference for similar mental health programs that have hit, to expand services, increase the number of well-trained professionals, increase awareness of the need for mental health. There was the public service announcement. There's more to the story that we funded through this, particularly trying to relate to our young adolescents, our young adults, our emerging adults, that so often parents or school personnel would say, "How are you doing?" And their response, "Okay," or "Fine." And the public service announcement was trying to give folks tools to know that sometimes there's more to the story and just ask a little bit more. And some of it is to increase technology to underserved groups, for students studying remotely. Again, I know that so much more needs to be done, and I am fully committed to achieving parity in the Commonwealth, parity of mental and behavioral treatment with physical health. And I will continue to amplify your voices on these areas, all of these areas.
Thank you so much, Senate President Spilka. Just really phenomenal to hear all that's taking place.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, at this point, we have concluded our formal presentation, but we did just want to send a huge thank you to our translators, Afrenio and Linda, as well as our interpreters, Kaylee and Veronica. We couldn't have done this without you. Our panelists, John, Tiffany, Katie. So huge thank you just to all of you who have made today possible.
Thank you. And I would just like to take this opportunity also of thanking everybody. Tiffany, Katie, John, great information. You know, a lot of concrete tips on how parents could help, teachers, school personnel, how we could help each other. I particularly like the ideas of being positive. You know, we all need to be positive, and the specific tip, instead of putting blame or saying to a kid, "Why are you doing that?" You know, if they're playing a lot of video games or whatever, and they need to be doing something else, of saying, "How can I help you do X?" I mean, that is such a concrete, tangible, and more positive way to go about doing it. And I appreciate the staffing comments, and I will take that certainly to heart. But I also want to thank the folks from the Rennie Center, Sophie for your presentation, Annalise for moderating that panel. All of you shared such great insight into the state of mental health in our Commonwealth and what we can do as active parents, educators, and community members. I'm sure we'll be in touch and working together in some capacity in the future. And I thank you for what you all do in your community. I know it hasn't been easy for all of you as well. So from the bottom of our heart, thank you. The problems that our young people are up against can really seem daunting. Even in a more ordinary time than now, it's daunting. Their mental health matters. It's as simple as that. Their mental health matters. Mental health is not just one of the many competing priorities that we can address. In my view, mental and behavioral health and well-being are fundamental, deeply fundamental to all aspects and activities of our individual lives, and profoundly reflected in our society. Becoming healthier isn't just good for ourselves, which it definitely is, but it's also good for the world that we live in. What I love about Transformative SEL is that one adult can make a difference in a child's life. Just think of that, one adult, that's huge. That really is huge. In order to make that difference in someone's life, that adult needs to connect with the child, have an understanding, basic at least understanding of social and emotional learning, and some critical resources. So I'm sure all of you here today came to this event because of a young person or young people that you know and desired to help them in this trying time. So you have a connection. Our expert panelists and our friends from the Rennie Center have generously shared their knowledge on transformative social and emotional learning and gave us a higher definition view of how to apply it to our own relationships. So you have something now of an understanding of SEL. And as for the support and resources to reinforce this throughout our communities, I will reiterate that I will continue to prioritize and fight for you on this. As the Commonwealth, Massachusetts is putting more resources towards ensuring that all public school students can access support structures even during the pandemic. This support really matters, whether that means getting more staff and more training and more compensation, I know that, or getting students access to remote counseling. As I said earlier, I am fully committed to achieving parity of mental health with physical health. We're fighting for one continuous stream, all of us, a continuous stream of healthcare accessible to all of the residents of our Commonwealth, no matter how young or how old. That is the goal. So know that Transformative SEL is a tool in your hands that you can use to change others' lives with your support. It sounds complex, but in a lot of ways, it's easy. Know that my door is always open and that I am always ready to engage in ideas, any new ideas that you have on how Massachusetts can respond to this very important issue or any other issue, because we are all in this together and we will all get through this time together. So thank you for joining us. Please stay healthy and well and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder, I sent this out in the chat, but the resources from this event, including a resource guide with all of the places to find more information, will be on the Senate President's website. You can find that in the chat, as well as some of our Rennie Center resources. But thanks again, everyone. Thanks again to our interpreters. We are so glad that you came to our event, and please feel free to check out those resources. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.